Happy New Year's Eve. It is December the 31st, 2017. Welcome to my January forecast. We'll go ahead and get it started with the number one forecast thought that is really driving my passion for what I think is going to happen for this upcoming January of 2018. The number one thing is the Siberian snow cover back in October. You're probably wondering why I'm even referring back to that. If you watched my winter forecast video around 2 months ago or so, you noticed that I did refer back to the snow cover in Siberia at the very end of October and the very rapid amplification of it, and how I thought that it led to that amplification of the Pacific jet last midwinter. That led to warmer temperatures and a midwinter thaw, and this is really driving my passion to say that we could be looking at something similar to that for this upcoming middle of winter, around the middle of January. The North Pacific moderation to ridging is starting to take place, and because of this, I think that we're going to see some slightly warmer temperature anomalies as we go towards the end of the month. Downstream eastern U.S. temperature moderation teleconnections are supporting the EPO and WPO positive trend, and this is going to really portray possibly a warmer look as we go into the very end of the month, in the middle of the month as well. So let's talk about that October Siberian snow cover. Back in 2016, we saw a rapid snow growth at the very end of the month, and that led to a midwinter warm-up. That's what I think it led to. There are some other meteorologists, and I am not a meteorologist, by the way. I do want to clarify that. I am going to eventually be one, but there are actual meteorologists that are actually have other different thoughts on how that rapid snow growth ended up impacting the winter last year. A lot of them don't think that it led to that midwinter warm-up. I do. I think it led to an amplification of the Pacific jet stream. We ended up seeing warmer temperatures because of that, and we are also looking at a similar setup. Everything that happened last year that led to that midwinter warm-up is happening this year, and so I think that we're looking at possibly a similar thing. Let me show you that visually here. In 2016, on October 26th, you're looking at Siberia right here where my mouse is circling. You see that a lot of this is not even snow covered. Now, meanwhile, this is still well above average compared to what they should be seeing for snow cover at that time of the year. We get to October the 30th, we're even more well above average. So we see that rapid amplification of that cool air leading to a lot of snowfall across the region, or rather vice versa, a lot of the snowfall leading to cooler air. We have a lot of cold air driving into the northern Pacific. It leads to colder sea surface temperature anomalies. We end up seeing that cooler air, and oftentimes the cooler air is associated with more storminess, and we're looking at that stormier pattern going into the northern Pacific, leading to that amplification of the Pacific jet stream, and that always leads to some warmer air for our portion of the country. In 2017, this year, on October 22nd, we saw this current image of the Siberian snow cover. We get to October 28th, and then boom, we see a rapid amplification. Not as much, I think, of an amplification of snow cover as we saw last year, but still, that rapid amplification of it, I do think, is still prominent and might still lead to that Pacific jet stream becoming more active as we go into the middle of January or the middle of winter, whichever way you want to look at it. And if this does happen, we will see another warm-up come into the area like we saw last year. Although last year we saw warmer air at the very end of December, and we're not seeing that this year. And that warmer air led and it bled into the beginning of January, and then it began to continue throughout the rest of the month and on into the beginning of February. Really, it just lasted all the way until the very end of February, early March, and we saw a big cool down for the first couple weeks of March, and that was really it to all of last winter. Whereas this year, we are finishing December with or not well below average temperatures, but slightly below average temperatures. Last year, we ended up above average, and so we are seeing a cooler look this year than we saw last year. So I don't think we're looking at as warm of a midwinter warm-up as we saw last year. I still think, back at the beginning of my winter forecast that I posted about 2 months ago, I still think that we cool back down going into February and we see a stormier pattern take shape. But for right now, this January midwinter thaw idea is still pretty strong in my mind. And another thing that is coming up that is supporting this thought is that the North Pacific pattern is beginning to change just a little bit. Not that much, but it is beginning to change, at least signs of it. Moderation to ridging around the second week of January has been pretty consistent in the models over the last couple of days, and this is oftentimes going to lead to that downstream warmth across the eastern United States, and it would just so happen to shape up with that mid-month or midwinter warm-up that I've been having in my mind for the last couple of months. So here's a map of January the 12th in the northern Pacific. We see a lot of ridging starting to take place across the eastern half of the Bering Sea, and going with the Bering Sea roll, anything you see there, you see take shape around 6 to 10 days later in the eastern United States. We can expect that we begin to see that eastern half of the Siberian Sea warming up, showing that the eastern half of the United States could possibly be warming up during the 6 to 10 day time frame after that. That would put us anywhere between January the 18th through January the 22nd. That's around the middle of the month, around the middle of winter. So I think it's all shaping up pretty nicely. Now, whether that actually happens is still up in the air. Teleconnection support that we see the WPO and the EPO, also known as the West and East Pacific Oscillation, trending positive as we go into the second week of January. This is also going to lead to another warm-up, I think, going into the middle of the month. Here's a look at the West Pacific Oscillation. We see that positive trend. Here's a look at January the 27th, 28th, 29th time frame. I begin my arrow there. I draw it all the way out to where the models begin to stop showing any sort of forecast, which would be around January the 10th, and that would be putting us into the second week of January. So we're seeing that positive trend. Same thing with the Eastern Pacific Oscillation, or the EPO. We see that positive trend going into the second week of January, leading to that midwinter warm-up, I think, as we see that correlation between the teleconnections and our surface temperatures here in the United States back and forth. So while this is not set in stone, I still think that the first half of the month is going to be well below average. We're already beginning to see that. We're looking at single digits possible going into the new year, and all the way into at least the second week of January, we're still looking at those well below average temperatures. We get into the second week, I think that's our transition week. We begin to see a little bit of a flip-flop back and forth. Possibly that means more stormier weather, and I still think that once we get towards around the middle of the month, we see that warmer air surge up, oftentimes leading to a little bit more of a stormier outlook. And I do think that we see well above average, not well above average. I do think that we see slightly above average precipitation, and that we see slightly above average temperatures. Now, I am the outlier. A lot of meteorologists are showing that we see a colder outlook for January, and I'm thinking otherwise. I just think that we are seeing that similar outlook to what we saw last year at this time, although there are differences in the Decembers from last year to this year, but the Januaries are looking pretty similar. I don't think it's going to be as scorching as last year's January, because if you remember, in 2016, or rather this would be January of 2017, we saw well above average temperatures entering into the new year. And we're not seeing that this year. This year we're looking at least the first half of the month well below average, and if the temperatures are below average enough, then we might even see a warm-up going into the end of the month, but when you finalize it all, it might still be below average because of how cold the first half of it was. So that is still up in the air as well. How strong do these temperature anomalies get above average as we go into the end of the month, if they even do? And if they even get above average, how stormy does it get? So there is a lot of questions that still remain. I am the outlier, and a lot of meteorologists are actually acknowledging that this is a possible solution, that we see this amplification of the Pacific jet stream, and this would lead to a stormier outlook going into the middle of the winter, in the middle of January. I still think that this is going to be a prominent playmaker as we go into the middle of the month, and right now we'll stand and see what this ends up shaping up to be as we go into the middle of winter, the middle of January. And hopefully this stormier outlook, typically in January, even though it's warmer than average, it's still cold enough to produce wintry precipitation. So this could correlate to possibly a more wintry type to this entire month as we go into that transition period around the second week of January. We're starting to flip back and forth between that cold and that warm air. We might begin to see some wintry precipitation during that time frame. I've watched a lot of winter storms over the last couple of weeks go downhill for our region, not seeing any wintry precipitation, and we might not be going into the next couple of weeks. But for sure, the first half is cold. The second half is really up in the air. That's when the meteorologists begin to trail off and branch off into what seems to be colder than average, but I think otherwise. We'll see how it shapes up, but besides the point, have a perfect new year, and we'll see you in January of 2018.